The steering box out of the Daimler is a Miles cam and double roller type. What I'm going to do is to pull it apart and clean it up, check its condition, and also adjust the any backlash inside the mechanism. The steering column as it is almost complete. There's a few bits missing off the top, which I'll find somewhere in the boxes. So at this stage I'll pull it apart, then I'll clean up and repaint the housing and shaft, or the outer shaft, and then work on the inside to make the necessary adjustments. The various pieces of the steering column are cleaning up well. What the finish I've got on there is an enamel, black enamel. It looks quite good. I haven't bothered putting it all back together yet. I managed to find all the relevant pieces, so that was a good start. The quadrant for the gear selector, I'll probably, and that's brass. I may decide just to clean that up so it has a brass look, and the only problem with that is then you've got to keep it clean, but it's not that large, so I may just let's say clean that up a little bit, and with these I'll repaint the black in between the numbers, so that's not too bad. Started to put the steering gear back in, the rocker. Yes, I cleaned that up on the lathe, so that's gone in. That seems to fit okay. I haven't adjusted it yet. I'll go through the adjustment process. That's probably the next process I'll go through, just to make sure I've got it right. I've got some instructions on how to adjust this type of steering box, so I'll show what I do. It's not a hard process, but it's one you've got to go through to make sure there's no slop in the mechanism. I certainly don't want to go to the extent of putting it all back together and getting it in the car and then finding out it's all too loose. Anyway, it's coming together quite nicely. I've actually assembled it just temporarily with a couple of bolts. I can probably adjust this shaft without this in, but I've just put that in place to keep all the parts clean. Now there are two ball races on the end of the shaft. They fit either side of the actual worm gear that's on the end of the shaft. I've put those in place. The outer race is held in by this cup here. This cup here, which I've just tapped in place. Now, depending on the wear in the two sets of bearings, that should just sit proud of the end of the housing. Now, the idea is you're not meant to have any movement in the shaft. By the same token, when you bolt this on, just drop that on the floor, when you bolt this plate on, it will tend to push that cup hard in on the ball race, which will make obviously the shaft harder to turn and also wear the ball race. So what you have to do is to put sufficient shims between the plate and the housing so it basically remains without any movement in the shaft. It's a bit of trial and error. Now you can use a feeler gauge in the end here, just putting that up against the end of the bearing cup. I could fit some feeler gauges in there and work out what the gap is, and then what you have to do is to shim it. Now the shims in the seal kit I got with for the actual shaft itself, got a few seals. Obviously one is for this seal here and the bottom one here. Now what I've got to do is to make sure that that is not too thick. When I pulled the old shaft apart, and these didn't come in the kit, is that I found these are basically paper shims, very thin. Now I assume these are about 1 thou each. So what I can do is to use these to build up enough space so there is no movement. Now I've got a micrometer which I can use to measure the thickness of the gaskets, but the first task is to actually measure the gap that I'm trying to fill with the actual main gasket and the shims. So I'll do that next, and then I'll determine the right number of gaskets. Now the remaining adjustment of the steering box is in relation to what they call the rocker arm there, which is this. This roller actually goes on the worm on the end of the steering shaft, and on the end of this you would normally have 2 thrust washers, which are these two thrust washers. This one with the chamfered edge goes towards the housing there. This one here goes out towards the housing on the box itself, and in between they can have shims. Now what I've done is that I've mixed and matched the shims and the thrust washers from 2 different boxes. What you're meant to do is to, according to the instructions I have anyway, is to get it into the centre of its travel, which that is pretty much where it is now. You're meant to put thumb pressure on the end of that to hold it up against the housing, so you're holding all of the thrust washers and shims up against the housing so they're nice and tight. And then while you're holding that with your thumb, you wiggle that backwards and forwards and see if there's any movement. Now what I found is it's very hard to tell whether there's movement or whether this whole shaft is bouncing up and down. So what I've done is to actually put the end plate on and just hold that with the pressure. What that does is centralise the shaft. Just tighten the thumb screw there just so it's touching the end, so the shaft is not coming back, and then hold that and see if there's any movement. And when you do that and you've eliminated the movement, then the adjustment is right. You're not meant to be able to get any movement backwards and forwards. Now with this there was a slight movement. I tried to find an appropriate shim, but unfortunately I only had 2 shims, one extremely thin, which is this one, and one probably at least 30 thou thick. So what I've done, I've taken the largest of the thrust washers, I put it on the linisher and just it didn't take much, no more than 2 thou off the inside face. That's the face that faces the shims anyway. It's not the actual bearing face onto the housing. Having done that, it's now eliminated all the movement in the end of the rocker shaft. So when you're turning it backwards and forwards, there's no backlash between the roller and the gear that it's sitting in, so that's right. And then when I put this cap back on properly, and of course I've got to replace the seal on the front, which I haven't done yet, then you just tighten that up so there's no end play in the end of the rocker shaft itself, because if there is, what will happen then, it'll come out from the worm drive and actually then end up with more movement. So that's how you adjust it. It's a little bit more complex than most people think. I guess most people, and I include myself in that, always thought that the adjustment was just in this. You tighten that up and that would take any play out. Well, yes, that takes some of the play out, takes the end float out of the rocker shaft, but it doesn't take any of the movement between the roller and the worm drive. So you've actually got to do a lot more. There were 3 adjustments: end float in the shaft, end float in that rocker shaft, and also the mating of the roller and the worm drive. So when you've done those 3, you've done the best you can, and hopefully there's not too much movement left in the steering when it all goes back together.